In 1972, a group of MIT scientists warned that if humanity kept chasing endless economic growth without accounting for environmental limits, we could face societal collapse by 2040. Their prediction wasn't a wild guess. It came from a computer model that tracked how population, industry, food, and pollution interact over time. Now it's 2025, and a recent KPMG analysis says we're following the business as usual path even more closely than expected. In some areas, we're actually outpacing the original projections, with certain indicators trending worse than the baseline. With just 15 years until the MIT model's predicted collapse window, it's worth asking, how did they come up with these numbers in the first place? The original MIT Doomsday model. The foundation for all these predictions was the World 3 model, developed at MIT in the early 1970s. This was one of the first large-scale attempts to use computers to simulate the long-term consequences of exponential growth on a finite planet. The World 3 model tracked 5 global variables: population, industrial output, food production, resource availability, and pollution. These weren't isolated data points. Instead, the model mapped out how each factor influenced the others through feedback loops, where a change in one area could set off a chain reaction that circled back to amplify the original problem. Even with the limited computing power of the time, the researchers were able to program World 3 to reflect the complex nonlinear relationships that define real-world systems. For example, if industrial output increased, so did pollution. More pollution could damage crops, which would then impact food production and eventually population growth. These feedback loops were central to the model's projections, showing how small changes could quickly escalate into much larger problems. The MIT team ran 12 different scenarios by tweaking key assumptions, like the pace of technological innovation, rates of resource discovery, and how quickly societies might respond to warning signs. The most optimistic scenario assumed rapid global cooperation and breakthrough technologies that could solve emerging problems as they appeared. Most scenarios, though, reflected more moderate or delayed responses, while the business-as-usual case assumed society would continue on its current path without major interventions. Across the scenarios, the World 3 outputs followed a similar pattern: steady exponential growth in population and industry through the late 20th century, followed by a period of mounting stress as resource depletion and pollution started to bite. The model didn't claim to predict specific dates, but it did show that under most conditions, the tipping point for instability would arrive sometime between 2020 and 2040. The breakdown wasn't imagined as a sudden catastrophe. Instead, the model projected gradually compounding crises, declines in food production, rising pollution, and falling industrial output that would eventually overwhelm society's ability to cope. Technology's influence in the simulations was mixed. In some runs, new inventions helped delay or soften the impacts of resource scarcity and pollution. In others, technological advances simply accelerated extraction and consumption, making underlying problems worse. The researchers were clear that the model couldn't anticipate the exact nature of future innovations. Instead, they focused on how new technologies might interact with the system's basic constraints. What stands out from World 3's results is the emphasis on interconnected stresses. The model rarely showed collapse triggered by a single disaster. More often, it was the accumulation of multiple slow-moving breakdowns across food, resources, and industry that caused societies to falter. Even when surface-level stability continued for a while, the underlying supports were eroding, setting the stage for a sudden loss of resilience. The MIT team's most optimistic scenario required a level of global cooperation and foresight that was unprecedented, even by today's standards. Most of the other paths assumed that recognition of limits would come too late or that responses would be insufficient. The business-as-usual trajectory, in particular, projected a clear pattern of overshoot and collapse, one that, in retrospect, aligns uncomfortably well with several real-world trends. Importantly, the researchers never presented their work as a prophecy. Instead, they viewed the model as a tool for exploring how complex systems might behave under different assumptions. The main insight wasn't about pinpointing exact years for collapse, but about revealing the deep interconnections between population, industry, food, resources, and pollution. Those relationships, they argued, would determine the fate of modern civilization. Half a century later, the question is whether the original model was perfect. It's whether the broad patterns it identified still hold up when tested against real-world data. Recent analyses have taken a fresh look at the MIT projections, comparing them to what's actually happened since the 1970s. 2025 update: are we ahead of schedule? By 2020, Gaya Harrington, an analyst at KPMG, set out to see how the MIT World 3 model compared to the real world nearly 50 years after its debut. She pulled together data through 2019 and lined it up against the original scenarios. The results were unsettling. Today's global trends most closely follow the business-as-usual 2 scenario, where collapse is driven by pollution overload rather than simple resource exhaustion, as KPMG's findings highlight. Population growth isn't a perfect match, but it's tracking within the projected range. The UN estimates the world population in 2025 at about 8.1 billion. That's a bit below the MIT model's central forecast, but still well within the boundaries where the model's feedback loops apply. The main difference comes from where the growth happens. Developing countries have outpaced the projections, while developed economies have slowed down faster than expected. This has created global imbalances the original model didn't fully anticipate. Industrial output is a sharper indicator. Since 2021, manufacturing has rebounded from pandemic lows to hit new highs, echoing what the business-as-usual scenarios anticipated. Global industrial production grew by around 6% last year, but this growth is concentrated in a handful of manufacturing giants, while other regions lag or stagnate. This uneven expansion increases systemic fragility. One shock in a major hub can ripple through the entire network. Food production presents a more complicated picture. The MIT model expected a direct connection between rising pollution and crop failures. Instead, climate change has introduced unpredictable disruptions, unprecedented droughts in some regions, floods in others. Global grain reserves are now at 30-year lows, not because of a single disaster, but due to a series of overlapping regional crises. The model captured the broad trend, rising food stress, but underestimated how tightly interconnected these problems would become. Resource availability shows the clearest break from 1970s expectations. New extraction technologies have expanded known oil reserves, delaying depletion timelines. But critical minerals, like lithium and rare earth elements, are vanishing faster than the original model anticipated. World 3 treated resources as largely interchangeable, but modern technology has created new bottlenecks and hyperspecific shortages. Pollution data, on the other hand, validates some of MIT's most troubling predictions. Atmospheric CO2 has reached 425 parts per million, exceeding even the business-as-usual trajectory. Microplastics have been found everywhere from Antarctic ice to human tissue. The surprise isn't just the scale of pollution, but the emergence of new contaminants that the original researchers couldn't have foreseen. Since 2021, almost every negative trend has accelerated. Supply chain breakdowns have made resource distribution less reliable. Climate disasters have become more frequent and costly. Political instability has surged in the wake of pandemic disruptions. The model didn't account for black swan events like COVID-19, but its baseline projections now look almost optimistic by comparison. Harrington's update highlights 2 main paths: the comprehensive technology scenario, where innovation eases the landing, and the more pessimistic business-as-usual 2 track. Current data shows elements of both. Renewable energy adoption is advancing faster than expected, which matches the tech scenario. But pollution and inequality trends are closely tracking the collapse trajectory. The food situation is a good example of this split. Advances in agricultural technology have pushed yields beyond what MIT projected. We produce enough to feed billions more. Yet over 800 million people still go hungry, not because of global shortages, but because distribution systems haven't kept up. This is the modern collapse pattern. Isolated solutions exist, but systemic coordination is failing. Resource trends show a similar contradiction. We've found more oil, but fresh water is running out. The Colorado River can't meet its allocations, and major aquifers are nearing exhaustion. Progress in one area is canceled out by decline in another, mirroring the feedback loops the MIT team warned about. Political instability adds new layers. The original model didn't anticipate how social media would amplify polarization or how financial systems would concentrate risk. Since 2021, these forces have accelerated, interacting with older threats in unpredictable ways. Taken together, the alignment between today's data and the MIT projections is difficult to ignore. The timing may shift, but the mechanisms, population pressure, industrial growth, pollution, and resource stress continue to interact as the model described. The technology has changed, but the underlying dynamics remain. As we move further into 2025, these patterns are showing up most clearly in the global economy, where the warning signs are becoming harder to overlook. Economic indicators, the collapse scorecard. Economic signals in 2025 closely mirror the stress points MIT's model anticipated under its business-as-usual scenario. Growth has slowed sharply, with most forecasts showing a clear deceleration across major economies. Instead of steady expansion, we see businesses pulling back on investment and hiring, a pattern that often foreshadows broader stagnation. Unemployment is ticking upward, and the Philadelphia Fed notes that recession signals have tripled since last year. These shifts don't look dramatic in isolation, but together they reveal a system losing momentum. Debt now props up much of the economy. National debt levels keep setting new records, and the reliance on borrowing has become routine rather than exceptional. With the possibility of tariffs rising and fiscal policy tightening, analysts warn that a spike in interest rates could force governments into an austerity trap, where spending cuts and tax hikes are needed just to keep up with debt payments. In the worst-case scenario, this could tip economies into contraction, echoing the constraints MIT's model predicted would eventually limit growth. Supply chains, once seen as a model of efficiency, have become a source of persistent vulnerability. Trade deals stall or unravel, and even the threat of higher tariffs, potentially reaching 25%, creates ripple effects across industries. These disruptions aren't just raising prices, they threaten to shut down entire sectors, much as the original model envisioned when resource bottlenecks began to cascade. The interconnectedness that once made the global economy resilient now amplifies every shock. Inequality continues to widen. The concentration of wealth has accelerated beyond what the MIT team imagined, with the top tier accumulating assets at a rate that leaves most households behind. Housing costs have soared in most urban centers, making homeownership increasingly out of reach for average earners. The original model didn't fully anticipate how financialization would allow capital to accumulate so unevenly, but the result is a system where opportunity narrows even as headline wealth grows. Inflation remains stubborn. Forecasters expect consumer prices to keep rising faster than wages, putting more pressure on household budgets. Central banks try to manage the balance between curbing inflation and supporting growth, but their tools look increasingly blunt. Meanwhile, uncertainty in currency markets grows as investors look for alternatives, not because other currencies are stronger, but because confidence in the status quo keeps eroding. Employment data shows a split reality. On one hand, official unemployment rates remain moderate. On the other, workforce participation has yet to recover, and more people are stringing together multiple jobs to cover basic expenses. This hidden stress surfaces later in declining health outcomes and lower productivity. The volatility in job markets makes employers hesitant, feeding a cycle of caution that slows recovery. Consumer debt is climbing. Credit card balances reach new highs each quarter, while savings rates fall. This isn't driven by luxury spending. It's a reflection of people using debt to cover essentials as real wages lag behind. MIT's model assumed consumer behavior would remain stable, but today's debt-driven survival strategies reveal a more fragile foundation. Financial institutions pass regulatory stress tests, but cracks are visible. Commercial real estate struggles with high vacancy rates, and regional banks merge to avoid insolvency. The system's stability now depends as much on perception as on fundamentals. Everyone senses the risk of a sudden loss of confidence, but few want to be the first to act. The Conference Board's leading economic index has dropped steadily, signaling a likely recession ahead. Weakness spreads across sectors. Manufacturing, construction, and services all show signs of strain. What stands out is the breadth of these warning lights. Instead of isolated trouble spots, nearly every major indicator points to underlying fragility. When measured against MIT's original scenarios, current trends most closely follow the business-as-usual two-path, where collapse results from a convergence of systemic failures. Economic stress is not coming from a single source, but from an accumulation of pressures. Debt, inflation, inequality, and supply chain breakdowns all interact, just as the model predicted. Borrowing has delayed some impacts, but the underlying stresses are converging. Technological innovation, once expected to offset these risks, has had mixed results. Automation eliminates jobs faster than new sectors can absorb workers. Productivity gains concentrate in a few industries, while others stagnate. The promise of broad-based benefits hasn't materialized, leaving many on the outside looking in. Supply shocks now arrive from unexpected directions. A canal blockage, a drought, or a semiconductor shortage can disrupt entire markets. The complexity of the global system, once a strength, now creates fragility that simple economic models struggle to capture. Resource depletion remains a concern, but the brittleness of trade and finance has become just as critical. All these signals point to an economy entering the danger zone outlined decades ago. This isn't a sudden collapse, but a period where stress compounds and responses lag behind. The The MIT model suggested that this phase would begin around now, intensifying through the coming decade. As the evidence mounts, it's clear that economic fragility is only one part of the larger picture. Environmental crises, accelerating the timeline. Environmental breakdowns now unfold in ways that even the most pessimistic models from the 1970s did not fully anticipate. The World Meteorological Organization recently confirmed that 2024 marked the hottest year on record, with global temperatures reaching nearly 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. This milestone arrives decades ahead of the gradual warming that MIT's World 3 model projected. The last 10 years have each ranked among the warmest ever measured, compressing what was expected to be a slow trend into a single, relentless decade. One of the clearest signals of crisis is the rapid decline of coral reefs. Since 2009, nearly 14% of the world's coral has disappeared, primarily due to warmer, more acidic oceans. These reefs are not just colorful backdrops, they anchor marine food chains and protect coastlines from storms. Their loss signals a breakdown in ecosystem stability, and the pace of die-off outstrips anything the original models foresaw. Deforestation continues at a scale that erases entire ecosystems each year. Human activity has now altered over 70% of ice-free land, with primary forests vanishing fastest. The Amazon and Southeast Asia remain frontlines, but Africa's deforestation rate now matches them, showing that the problem is global rather than regional. The World 3 model anticipated resource depletion, but satellite data reveals forest loss accelerating in areas once considered relatively stable. Climate change acts as a force multiplier for these crises. Extreme weather events have become more frequent and severe. Heat waves last longer and set new records, while tropical storms form earlier and intensify more quickly. Floods and droughts now occur in regions previously thought safe from such extremes. These events disrupt food production, damage infrastructure, and displace communities, amplifying the stress on already fragile systems. Biodiversity loss compounds the problem. Human land use, especially for food production, remains the main driver, but climate change now accelerates the decline. Species extinctions are no longer theoretical, they are happening in real time, with the first climate-driven extinctions already documented. The disappearance of key species destabilizes entire ecosystems, leading to cascading effects that the original MIT researchers could not have fully predicted. Freshwater shortages have reached critical levels in several regions. Major rivers like the Colorado can no longer meet their legal allocations, and aquifers beneath key agricultural zones are being depleted faster than they can recharge. The World 3 model predicted resource constraints, but the speed and concentration of water crises in food-producing regions have exceeded expectations. Pollution adds another layer of complexity. Greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, with coal, oil, and natural gas still the main sources. Microplastics and chemical contaminants now appear in every environment, from mountain peaks to ocean trenches. These pollutants alter ecosystems in ways that go beyond the scope of the original models, introducing new variables and feedback loops. Natural carbon sinks like forests and oceans once absorbed a significant share of emissions, but their capacity is now diminished. As forests burn or die, they release stored carbon instead of capturing it. Warming oceans absorb less CO2, further accelerating atmospheric buildup. These feedbacks amplify the pace of change, making mitigation more difficult with each passing year. The comprehensive technology scenario, where rapid innovation offsets environmental damage, has not materialized at the necessary scale. While renewable energy adoption is growing, fossil fuels still dominate, and carbon capture remains too expensive for broad deployment. Nature-based solutions, such as restoring forests and wetlands, are essential but underfunded and slow to implement compared to the speed of degradation. On nearly every environmental measure, current trends align more closely with the business-as-usual 2 scenario from the MIT model, where pollution and ecosystem breakdown drive declines in food production, health, and economic stability. The feedback loops between environmental and economic systems intensify the risks, creating a landscape where local crises quickly become global shocks. These environmental realities do not exist in isolation. They interact with political and social systems, shaping responses and revealing new vulnerabilities. As the natural world reaches critical thresholds, the strains on governance and cooperation become more visible, setting the stage for the next layer of instability. Political chaos, modern empire fragmentation. Political chaos in 2025 is not confined to isolated regions. It is a global phenomenon that increasingly shapes the world's trajectory. The most pressing geopolitical risks are now concentrated in a handful of hotspots, each with the potential to trigger wider instability. The ongoing war in Ukraine, for instance, has entered a more violent phase, with a 63% increase in battlefield activity compared to the previous year, and steady territorial gains by Russia. Western support for Ukraine is wavering, and the conflict has already redrawn alliances and disrupted global energy markets. At the same time, the risk of escalation in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea remains high, as tensions between China and the United States simmer beneath the surface of diplomatic engagement. The Middle East is another major concern, with the Preventive Priorities survey ranking deteriorating security conditions there as the leading global risk. The region faces persistent fighting in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon, as well as the threat of a wider confrontation involving Iran and Israel. These conflicts are not isolated. They interact with economic pressures, migration flows, and resource competition, amplifying their impact far beyond their immediate borders. Democratic institutions are under strain in many countries. Election disputes have become more common, with losing parties increasingly contesting results and eroding public faith in the process. Legislatures struggle with basic governance, often unable to pass budgets or respond effectively to emerging crises. This gridlock appears in the US Congress and in several European parliaments, where coalition governments collapse over seemingly minor disputes. As societies face more complex problems, political systems are less able to deliver coordinated solutions. International cooperation continues to weaken. The United Nations Security Council remains deadlocked by vetoes, and major trade agreements are repeatedly renegotiated or ignored. Climate accords see little progress, even as environmental crises mount. The World Trade Organization reports a sharp rise in protectionist measures since 2020, reflecting a shift toward nationalism and self-interest. This retreat from multilateralism makes it harder to address problems that cross borders, such as pandemics, cyber threats, and climate change. Nationalist and populist movements have gained ground across continents. Recent elections in Europe, Asia, and the Americas show voters turning toward candidates who promise to prioritize national interests and restrict immigration. Many border restrictions imposed during the pandemic remain in place, and debates over migration dominate political discourse. The rhetoric has shifted from economic arguments to themes of cultural preservation and identity, fueling polarization and making compromise more difficult. Public trust in institutions is at historic lows. Surveys in the United States and Europe show declining confidence in governments, media, and major corporations. Anti-establishment parties capitalize on this disillusionment, drawing support from citizens who no longer believe that traditional systems can solve their problems. As trust erodes, people become more likely to disengage from politics or seek alternative sources of authority. Political polarization now extends beyond policy differences to fundamental disagreements about reality. Populations are divided into groups that operate with separate sets of facts, and social media platforms accelerate this fragmentation. Extreme views are amplified, moderates are sidelined, and compromise becomes rare. Governing becomes more difficult as leaders respond to increasingly divided constituencies, with little room for consensus. Military and cyber conflicts add new layers of risk. Beyond Ukraine, tensions in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, and Middle East create the potential for sudden escalation. Cyberattacks on critical infrastructure have moved from hypothetical to routine, targeting power grids, water systems, and transportation networks. The increasing digitization of essential services makes societies more vulnerable to disruption by both state and non-state actors. Breakdowns in governance are evident in countries facing state collapse, such as Haiti and Lebanon, as well as in stable democracies where basic administration falters. Coups and near-coups in parts of Africa, and persistent legislative dysfunction in wealthier nations point to a broader pattern of institutional stress. These are not isolated failures. They reflect systemic pressures that undermine the ability of political systems to adapt. Compared to what the MIT model anticipated, political instability is unfolding more rapidly and with greater complexity. The model foresaw institutional challenges, but it did not predict how digital media would accelerate division and distrust. Instead of a gradual erosion, many political systems now face rapid fragmentation, with consequences that spill across economic, social, and environmental domains. The forces pulling political systems apart are mirrored in the digital sphere, where platforms designed to connect people increasingly drive them into isolated camps. This fragmentation, once confined to politics, now shapes how societies interact, communicate, and understand the world. Social media and cultural breakdowns. Social media's role in 2025 is to accelerate change and fracture, shaping the ways people form relationships, consume information, and construct identity. Platforms have become engines for both connection and division, their algorithms tuned to maximize engagement, often by promoting the most polarizing or emotionally charged content. Internal platform data shows that users are now nudged toward more extreme material at far higher rates than even 5 years ago. The average person scrolls past hundreds of posts daily, but retains little trading depth for the constant novelty of the feed. The speed and reach of digital communication have transformed not only how people interact, but also how they perceive themselves and their communities.